Great. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all back after an exciting couple of talks. Danielle and Lola from the University of Sevilla are going to talk to us about resistance strategies, the possible bright side of online epistemic bubbles. So there is a bright side apparently. Over to you guys.
Okay, thank you very much. I will start introducing our presentation, and then Lola will go on with developing our thesis. So as you can see, our topic for our talk has been already discussed today, at least up to some point, making the distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. And these phenomena have been widely regarded as guilty of many of the problems found in internet communication, like this rupture of the public sphere, sometimes conspiracy theories, and so on. But as we will explain now, we have found the possibility that they are not always, in every case, as harmful as they are taken to be. So I will first introduce the main concepts in our talk with this distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. Then I will present the thesis that they are not always harmful, and then explain the scope of our talk. And then Lola will go on by explaining what is epistemic activism, which is the goal we hope to achieve sometimes with some specific kind of epistemic bubbles, and how the online epistemic bubbles can achieve that epistemic activism. And then she will present some further questions that we may ask about it. So the basic distinction we should make in this topic is that between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. We will not get in much detail again because they have been already explained today by Chris Blake Turner. But the key distinction here is that in one case, epistemic bubbles, the problem is about the connectivity in Nguyen's terms between the insiders and the outsiders. So it is not that insiders don't have any access to evidence, to other voices or other arguments. No, sorry. The problem is that they do not have that access to other voices or arguments. And these other voices are merely omitted. But in the echo chambers, the problem is the opposite. It's like I was saying, they do have access to evidence, and they may have access to data or to other arguments, experts' opinions, but they are massively distrust. Usually because they post trust over an overinflated trust in some leader inside the chamber. We have selected two examples we find for those two phenomena. And in the first case, we can find what we understand to be an epistemic bubbles, which is some shelter for women who have been abused or who have suffered violence. We take this to be an epistemic bubble because they share their experiences or share the information they have on their cases in a closed environment, and they are not listening to other voices, but they are not discrediting them massively, or not necessarily. Of course, we think this is a useful initiative and a helpful one and beneficial. So we are now starting by selecting an example of an offline epistemic bubble that could be beneficial. On the other hand, we have echo chambers like these conspiracy theories that have been discussed also. And in this case, we know that they have been confronted to experts' opinions, but they nevertheless keep on denying the data or denying the what the scientific community agrees on this topic. So we will focus on the first case, the epistemic bubbles, the problem with connectivity, and not the problem with the massive distrust to every outsider, of every voice outside the bubble. Then a second key distinction we have in mind is that between online epistemic bubbles and the filter bubbles. And we take this distinction to be of crucial importance, because in the case of the filter bubbles, we have the filtration effects of personalization technologies going on. So a clear example of that is that the debates on Twitter, in which we are usually recommended to follow political parties that think like us, or producers of content that will confirm our previous biases. In Facebook, we will be suggested to follow or to add friends that we will be like-minded. And that can, without any intention from part of the user, lead to the creation of these bubbles. We are focusing, in this case again, in online epistemic bubbles without focusing on these filtration effects. We acknowledge that they do exist and they are pervasive in every kind of online communication, but we will try as much as possible, or as it is reasonable, to leave them for further questions on this topic. So this would be a map we can deal about the problems in this area. Our concern is with online bubbles. Some of them, when they are filter bubbles, suffer from those effects from personalization technologies, which would lead to relevant questions now, which, where is the user's agency? Does she retain her agency, or is it transferred in some point to the algorithms, artificial intelligence, and whose interest leads these technologies? But we will leave these kind of questions for further questions, and we will not entertain ourselves with them, at least right now. And in general, these isolation topics regarding echo chambers or epistemic bubbles, they have a lot of problems associated. Like, they can be harmful for both their insiders, because they can hide some relevant knowledge for the insiders themselves, and also for the public sphere by fragmenting it or making some harmful theories or violent ideas more popular. This has been what has been in general discussed about the bubbles. So the conclusion has been, like we see, that bubbles are taken to be bad. At least that seems to be the general opinion. And while we acknowledge that it can be true, our thesis is that under proper conditions, these online epistemic bubbles can constitute a form of epistemic activism. And so they can be helpful for both the insiders when they are disadvantaged communities, and Lola will explain in what specifically why, and also for the whole society, because they would let the knowledge from those disadvantaged communities to be developed, to flow, and while in other cases with those bubbles, it could be lost if the members inside the bubbles don't get the confidence to share them, or so on. Lola will explain that with more detail. And we have mentioned these conditions being the retaining the user's agency and the epistemic activism. And again, Lola will explain with what this epistemic activism is exactly. So we do acknowledge a problematic side, specifically with the case of conspiracy beliefs. And we would just now, we would like to remind you the scope of our thesis. We are, again, leaving personalization technologies at one side of the issue. even though we acknowledge that this is pervasive in the internet. And again, we are only being concerned about the lack of exposure, the problem of connectivity, and not the problem of massive distrust in all the other voices and overinflated trust in our insiders, leaders, or something like that. So now Lola will explain our thesis and develop it.
So considering our thesis that is that under proper conditions, online epistemic bubbles can constitute a form of epistemic activism, we want to explain a bit further what epistemic activism is. And Medina and we understand that as a form of epistemic interaction that denounce and disrupt patterns of epistemic neglect and dysfunction. And specifically, they understand that epistemic activism can augment the epistemic agency of unfairly disadvantaged subjects, also amplify their voices, and facilitate the development and exercise of their epistemic capacities. So our thesis is that these three things happened sometimes in online epistemic bubbles also. And we will further develop this idea. So the idea is that these three things happened in online epistemic bubbles where unfairly disadvantaged communities are pervasive. So we want to share with you how this happens. So in the first case, the agency is augmented. We think that the cohesion that online epistemic bubbles have can improve the group agency. And how this can happen? Well, we think that members of these communities share basic knowledge and goals that doesn't have to be, again, explained or shared. And also members don't share, at least don't suffer, as much as other members outside bubbles to be heard. And this happens because, for example, norms in the communities, for example, in Facebook group, can be explicit. And also because in these communities, the membership or even the access to these communities can be controlled in the sense that trolls or people that don't share the norms or the ideas that the community is defending can be kicked out of the community. So this can, in our minds, improve the group agency. Secondly, we also think that the voices of these communities, these unfairly disadvantaged communities, can be spread in two senses. Inside the community, we can think of more followers, meaning more people know about the ideas or the experiences of the problems that these communities have. And outside the bubbles, the knowledge can be disseminated in ways that wouldn't be possible if these communities weren't existing or these communities weren't sharing their own experiences and knowledges. So this can happen in many ways, but we think that a useful way can be only by informing their followers, or also by launching different campaigns that can become viral for other members that don't belong to the community. And here we bring an example. This is a former colleague of mine from my master's, and this is a community that share what is going on with him. He's in prison for almost 2 years now in Egypt because of a paper he wrote, and he's not having a fair trial or a trial at all, but people can be can know about his situation because of the community online and because of the belonging to this community. And the third thing that we think that is possible with these online epistemic bubbles is the development and exercise of epistemic capacities, in the sense that epistemic barriers can be reduced. We think that for unfairly disadvantaged communities, there can be concept availability that otherwise wouldn't be possible, in the sense that injustices can reduce this concept or even mean a lack of the concept for the community. We think also that in these communities, they can share experiences that are common for every member. And we also think that the confidence of these members of the community can be higher or can be boosted. In what sense? Well, we think that anonymity can help to reduce the barriers, the epistemic barriers for the communities. And we also think that accessibility in many senses, not only in the bodily, physical sense of being able to access the community when you don't see or you don't hear or you don't move, but also in the sense of emotional accessibility, like you have fear or you are scared to participate in some sense, can help to reduce these epistemic barriers that some communities can face in their daily struggles. So even when, here having an example that is a community, a private community that you can only enter in some senses. If you are a member of this community, it means that either you live with this disease, a chronic disease, which is cystic fibrosis, or you're a relative of someone that lives with this condition. So here, this page is only to share memes about funny things or the experience that these people, patients have, and they cannot make fun of their lives and their experiences in a sense that they only can understand and they only can share. So this is a good example for this development and exercise. And we think that even when more advantages can be found, this will be enough to our thesis or to our idea that online epistemic bubbles can function as a form of epistemic activism in the sense that Medina and Nguyen are arguing. So of course, there are further questions that remain open and that we, of course, recognize. For example, as we said in the beginning, there's still problems about isolation or the influence of technologies, but this is out of our scope for today because it was too much and it's not in our interest today. Secondly, also, we think that some people can think that we're not dealing with epistemic bubbles anymore, but we want to argue that yes, we are still speaking about epistemic bubbles because there's still a lack of exposure for these communities, so they're still confined in some sense. And last one is that maybe this bubble does help the disadvantaged communities, but harms people outside the bubble. So to answer this question, we think that it's important to consider that when we're talking about communities or persons or people, subjects that are inside the communities, the bubble, they're not only in that bubble, but they can belong to many other, or they can have many other identities that make them be inside the bubble and at the same time outside the bubble in the sense of an intersectional approach of identities. And also it's important to consider that the friction that these communities have or these bubbles have is not only in between privileged communities and disadvantaged communities, but also two disadvantaged communities can have epistemic friction between them. So it's important to think about that too. So another thing that we think is important to consider is who belongs to this wider community. Is everyone's, just some, or who is this wider community that could be harmed, and which kind of harm they will be suffering. And that would be, we thank you all for your attention and we'll be open to any kind of question or comment you have. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Lola and Daniel.